At our recent conference in Estonia, someone asked me to give a crash course on this Buddhist concept of the interdependent originations, or as some Buddhists say, the dependent originations, or the dependent arising. And it's an important concept in Buddhism. There are actually some Buddhist scholars that say that it was discovering the dependent originations was part of what led the Buddha to his personal enlightenment. So let's take a closer look. So if we take a quick superficial explanation of what the interdependent origination means, we can say that it basically means that everything is connected. Therefore, everything is affected by everything else. And you might say, okay, what does that mean? How is that going to help my spiritual growth? Well, it's going to help you because it was by discovering the interdependent originations that the Buddha saw how we can overcome suffering. He actually saw the only way to overcome suffering. So we need to step back a little bit and look at a deeper meaning of the interdependent originations. But it can be subtle to grasp, so let me just start by comparing this to modern science. Because what has happened is that the Buddha talked about this 2,500 years ago, and it's taken about that long before modern science has caught up to where the Buddha was at in consciousness. And so we have in science, we have the two different systems of thought. We have classical physics and we have quantum physics. And in classical physics, the idea is that we have separate phenomena that are effects of separate causes. So in other words, you can look at life and you can isolate. Here is a phenomenon that we can study as an isolated object. And this isolated phenomena has an isolated cause. You have a billiard table. And the balls, there are three balls that are moving around. One ball is hitting the other and making the second ball move. So the second ball moving is an effect of the cause that the first ball is hitting it. And this led scientists to believe that the scientist can become this objective observer who's observing a phenomenon, measuring it without influencing it. Now, this ruled science for several hundred years, from Newton until Einstein, and then based on Einstein's findings, other scientists developed quantum physics. And in quantum physics, the idea that there are separate phenomena that can be measured by an independent observer who doesn't influence what he's measuring, it's just become obsolete after quantum physics. Because quantum physics has realized that basically, as I said, everything is interconnected. That means you can't isolate one phenomenon that is completely isolated from the rest of the world, and you can't have a phenomenon that's isolated from the observer. When the observer is making an observation, the consciousness of the scientist becomes part of the entire situation, which basically means that the scientist is co-creating what is measured. And this is what the Buddha saw. He saw that the common sensory-based perception tells us there's a world outside our minds. And that world is independent of our minds. There are many things that are happening in the world that we don't have any influence over with our minds. We can't stop them. And so most people are in this state of consciousness, thinking they are separated from the world, there are events in the world that they can't influence, and therefore they can't do anything about it. But what the Buddha saw was what quantum physicists have now seen, that there is an intimate, fundamental, existential connection between the outer world and the inner world, between the physical circumstances we experience in the world and our state of consciousness. Now, the Buddha also saw that this means that the situation we face in the world is, of course, not only created by your mind. It's also created by other people. And therefore, you can say that there is a certain situation in the world that you haven't created with your mind, that you haven't brought about by your mind. But nevertheless, your state of mind has a direct influence, first of all, on how you experience these conditions, how you react to them, and second of all, what kind of conditions will manifest in your life down the line. Because the Buddha, in a sense, saw that your current physical conditions were to some degree influenced by your state of mind in the past, even in past lives. The Buddha obviously taught reincarnation. So you can't just say, my physical conditions now, they just happened, I had nothing to do with it. You actually brought yourself into your current situation by your state of mind in past lives and even in this life. And therefore, if you want to change your conditions, you have to start by changing your state of mind. In other words, you could say that 2,500 years ago, most people were in this state of consciousness. Oh, the world is causing my suffering. Today, most people are in the same state of consciousness. The world is causing my suffering. And what the Buddha saw is that as long as you're in this state of mind, you will go from suffering to suffering. Life will be suffering. That's the first noble truth. Life is suffering if you are in this state of mind. But he also saw that there's a way out of suffering, which he called the Eightfold Path. And the way out of suffering is to fundamentally shift your state of mind. And this is where it gets a little bit subtle. So let's just try and illustrate it another way. Let's say that we recognize that everything is interconnected. Meaning, it's really meaningless to talk about a specific outer situation. You may be facing a situation, let's say you have difficulties with a supervisor at work. And you may tend to look at this situation, and you may even tend to say, well, it's a supervisor who's bullying me. I had nothing to do with it. I was just trying to do my job, and he's on my case all the time. What do I have to do with that? As long as you have that approach, you will continue to suffer. Because what can you do about it? You will think the only way to change my experience at work is to change the supervisor or change the way he behaves. And if you can't do that, well, you're stuck, right? And that's what the Buddha saw. So the Buddha said, if we are to overcome this suffering, we have to shift this mindset. And we have to start by realizing that the situation we face, we can't look at it as an isolated phenomenon. Instead, we can look at that life, not only in our personal lives, but on the planet as a whole. Humankind as one unit is like a river. You think about a river, it can be 5,000 kilometers long, very narrow at the beginning and very wide and slow at the exit into the sea. But nevertheless, if you look at the river, you can say, is it really individual water molecules or is it one big unit? Because the river is moving as one unit, even over this long distance. So what the Buddha saw was that there are certain things in life that you really can't change, these outer conditions. You can't change the outer conditions by working with the outer conditions. So you want to change your situation at work. It's not the Buddhic approach to try and change the outer situation. The Buddhic approach was try to change your state of mind because you always have control, or at least you have the potential to take control over the state of mind, and that's the Eightfold Path. So what the Buddha was essentially saying is that your mind is like a little boat that's floating on this river of life that connects everything. So everything is this unit. And you can't change the flow of the river. But if you take control over your state of mind, it's like realizing that your boat has a rudder. And you have control over this. You can turn the rudder. And right now, you might say, if your boat continues on its present course, downstream there's a rock, and you're going to hit it and crash the boat. But if you turn the rudder of the boat just a few degrees, you're going to miss the rock. And if you keep turning the rudder, in the long run, you might actually get away from all the rocks in the river and find a more smooth part of the river where there isn't the turbulence. And this is what the Buddha meant with the interdependent originations. Because what he really was seeing was that your present situation was a result of choices you had made in past lives. But the choices weren't so much the outer things that you did or didn't do, because whatever you did was an effect of your state of consciousness, your state of mind. And so the only way to really change the future course of your boat in the river is to change your state of mind. Obviously, you can't go back in time and change the state of mind you had 10 lifetimes ago. But you can look at yourself and say, do I still have that same state of mind today? Then I can change it today. And this will do two things for you. First of all, it will change the way you experience your present situation. Let's take the supervisor at work who's bullying you. What if it didn't bother you that he was bullying you? Would it be so bad? Would you necessarily have to change the outer situation if it didn't bother you? If you had no reaction to it? And that's what the Buddha said. The first step really towards escaping suffering is changing your reaction so you overcome what he called attachments. Attachment to this should happen, this shouldn't happen. And this is because you have this mechanism in your mind. Now, in many of my videos, I have described this mechanism in greater detail. I call it subconscious selves that form like a perception filter. We are seeing the world through the filter of these subconscious selves. And the way we see the world is what causes us to react a certain way. So you're looking at your situation at work at a certain way. You are thinking, oh, it should be pleasant to be at work and nobody should bother me. So therefore, here comes the supervisor who is bullying you and you feel bothered by it. You think the only way to react to this situation is to be bothered by it. But this is what the Buddha called an attachment. And if you overcome that attachment, you can say, why should it bother me? The supervisor is doing what he's doing, but why should that bother me? So the immediate effect of this would be that people who bully others is because they want a reaction from you. So if you stop reacting to the supervisor, he is most likely, at least after some time, going to stop bullying you and find somebody else where he can get a reaction. So this could be an immediate positive effect. But the other effect is that down the line, later in this lifetime, possibly in future lifetimes, you will attract yourself to better situations. So this is what the Buddha saw. And we could say that right now, there is a certain range of possible situations that could happen later in your life. In other words, you are in the boat on the river is moving, and within the range of what's possible for you to change, changing the rudder, there's a variety of scenarios. And some are not very positive, and some are much more positive. But what will determine which of these scenarios is selected? This is essentially also what quantum physics talks about. They are saying that in every situation, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, but you can predict probabilities. So there are certain probability or potentials that could happen. You can predict the probability that one or another scenario is going to happen when you take a measurement. And it's the same thing in life. You can predict right now there are certain scenarios that are possible in your life, and you can predict the probability of a given scenario coming to pass, becoming physical. And it's very simple. If you keep your present reactionary pattern, the most unpleasant scenario is the one that will manifest physically. But the Buddha was trying to teach us that if we follow the Eightfold Path and change our attachment, change our reactionary patterns, then we can select a positive outcome down the line in the river, because we change the course of the boat. So instead of hitting the rock, it now hits smooth sailing. So this is a very important part of the interdependent originations. It is that there are right now a potential range of scenarios that could happen later in your life. But which one is actually selected and becomes physically manifest is a matter of your state of consciousness. And even though you can't change the course of the river, you can change your course in the river by changing your state of mind. That's what, if you really step back from the Buddha's teachings, that's essentially what he was trying to tell people 2,500 years ago. It doesn't mean that you have unlimited possibilities, because you could have certain karma from past lives that it might be difficult to totally get away from in this lifetime, in just one lifetime. You could eventually do so. But still, with even so, there's a certain range of what might happen, and it's up to you to select which of the potential outcomes is going to manifest, and that is directly tied to your state of consciousness. So there's an interdependent origination between your state of consciousness and the physical circumstances that manifest in your life. And if you go back, you can say, whatever you have experienced in your life from the moment you were born, it was interdependently arising based on the state of consciousness you took with you from past lives, the karma you created in past lives, which is also tied to your state of consciousness. Because I've explained in some of my breakthrough videos that karma, there's one called karma is not a bitch, because karma isn't punishment. Karma is actually a teaching device to show us in the physical circumstances what we did in the past life, what state of consciousness we were in the past life. But if we change that state of consciousness before the karma descends to the physical, we don't have to experience the physical circumstances. Because the whole purpose of life is our transcendence of consciousness, which is also what the Buddha saw, of course. Okay, but now we need to step back even further. And this is something that goes a little bit beyond what the Buddha explained 2,500 years ago. But what I have explained today is that there's an even deeper connection between our state of mind and our physical circumstances. Because I have a video that's called How the World Was Created. And what I explained in that video is that we were all designed to be co-creators. So in other words, and I explained this in more detail in the video, but in other words, our world that we are in, this universe, physical world that we are in, was actually created by beings in the spiritual realm that I call ascended masters. And these beings, they created the earth in a certain condition, but it wasn't the perfect or finished condition. The whole idea was to create a certain environment, and then we were sent in here as self-aware beings, and our potential was that we could build on the foundation set by the spiritual beings, and build on that foundation and finish the co-creation. But what has happened instead is that we went into this state that the Buddha called Maya, or illusion. And by doing this, we have actually lowered the conditions on Earth beyond what they were originally. Originally, for example, there was no lack of resources or poverty on this planet. This is something that humankind has collectively co-created. So there are many conditions that we see today that we take for granted, we think they are natural or inevitable, that we actually collectively co-created, because we are co-creators. Now, how do we co-create, you might say? Well, we co-create through our state of mind. In other words, we create these structures in our subconscious mind that I call subconscious selves. The Buddha called them attachments. And we are projecting, with our self-awareness, we are projecting an image through these structures upon the basic energy that makes up the universe. And the universe, or the energy, takes on the form of this image we're projecting. Now, we can only do this within the parameters set by the spiritual beings who created the earth, but we have quite some leeway there, as you can see by the fact that we have created all the conflict and suffering that's found on earth. This wasn't originally there. The spiritual beings didn't create a planet where suffering was inevitable. In fact, there was no suffering when it was in its natural condition. So this is what we have co-created. And this is part of the interdependent originations. And it's very, very important to contemplate this. Because see, because of the nature of our minds and the nature of free will, which I also explained in more depth in the other video, it's so that we have two options for co-creating. We can co-create as connected beings, which is what we start out as. We start out seeing ourselves as connected to something outside our own minds, which is basically our higher selves and the spiritual beings that are our guides, our teachers. Or the other option is that we can go into a state of consciousness that I call the illusion of separation, where we see ourselves as separate beings and we lose the connection to our higher selves. Now we think we're separate beings. We think that there are separate causes and separate effects. And this gives rise to this illusion. That's the most common illusion on earth today is, I can kill somebody, and if society doesn't discover it and put me in jail, I've gotten away with murder. In other words, I can do unto others without the universe doing the same to me. And this is the common illusion that creates a lot of suffering. And this is what the Buddha saw was a complete illusion because of the interdependent originations. You can't get away with anything. Because whatever you do not only affects other people, but it will also affect you in the future in form of karma. But it will also affect you immediately because it affects your state of consciousness. It solidifies the state of consciousness that you are a separate being. And so this is what the Buddha called Maya, or the veil of illusion. That you think you are a separate being and you can do things and get away with it. And there's actually the original Buddhist scripture is called the Dhammapada, sorry. There are many different translations of it. But there was one I found a number of years ago, and the very first verses were such a profound translation that I memorized them. And it's this: preceded by perception are mental states. For them is perception supreme. If with polluted perception one thinks or acts, suffering follows. Okay, so let me just decode it a little bit. First, you have perception. In other words, you're in a certain situation. You are looking at that situation a certain way. And the way you look at the situation affects your mental state. So your perception of the world determines your mental state. And once you are in a certain mental state, you can't change the perception. In other words, you have the supervisor at work. You are looking at that situation through a certain perception filter. This is what I've explained with these subconscious selves. They form a perception filter. So you are having this perception filter. Nobody should bother me. They should leave me alone so I can do my work. So here comes the supervisor bothering you. And through this perception filter that nobody should bothering you, you get upset. You go into a mental state where you are upset. And once you are upset, you can obsess about the situation. You can go over it again and again and again. But from that state of mind, that mental state, you can't question the perception. You can't say, oh, is this really the only way to look at this situation? Could I possibly look at it in another way so I don't react negatively to the situation? Like I said, if it didn't bother you, would it be a problem? So this is what the Buddha saw. That as long as you have adopted a certain perception, which is, as I said, ultimately this idea you are a separate being, and that there are certain things that should or shouldn't happen to you as a separate being. As long as you have adopted this perception of the world, it inevitably leads to certain mental states. Those mental states determine your reaction, and they also set the stage of what's going to happen further down the line. In other words, they turn the rudder of your boat in a certain direction, so you're either heading for the rocks or heading for smooth sailing. And what the Buddha saw was that the only way to break out of the sea of samsara, the constant suffering, is to change your perception, to question your perception, which can start in a very practical way, a simple way, by you saying, why am I reacting this way? When I look at my life, I see that in certain situations, if somebody bothers me, for example, or if somebody accuses me of having done something wrong, I always react a certain way. Why do I do that? Is that the only way to react? And then you can look at the Buddha, who gave the example that when he was ready to enter nirvana, he was sitting under a tree in meditation, and all of the demons of Mara paraded before him, the demons of illusion. And they were trying to engage him, to tempt him, to force him, to manipulate him, to entice him to react to them. And he just sat there and didn't react to anything because he had no attachments. So this is the goal that the Buddha demonstrated, that if you want to escape suffering, you have to overcome these attachments which cause you to look at life a certain way and therefore go into certain mental states based on the way you perceive life. And so therefore, ultimately, the ultimate goal is to question this perception that you are a separate being. And what makes you trapped in this state of seeing yourself as a separate being is that you have been trapped in what I call the duality consciousness. The Buddha, 2,500 years ago, talked about the pairs. You go into a state of perception where you see everything in terms of two opposite polarities, good and bad, right and wrong, truth and error, this should happen, this shouldn't happen. So you have these two opposites and there's a scale in between them, and you are evaluating everything based on the scale. So everything is put on the scale somewhere. And as long as you are on the scale and having these dualistic polarities that are pulling you in different directions, your life can only be suffering. And what happens is that if, let's say again, you have 5 different scenarios that might manifest in your life. And the worst one, if you don't change your consciousness, if you keep having this sense of separation, the worst one is the one that you will magnetize to you. It's the one you will manifest. It's the one you will co-create. Because you are projecting mental images constantly through these subconscious selves. And so, but if you change it, if you change your perception, then you will attract to you the best possible scenario. And then what happens is that when you see that this actually worked, you can change your perception even more. And that will open up some possibilities that aren't even there now. So your life can then become an upward path of escaping suffering rather than going deeper and deeper into suffering. And this is what the Buddha saw, that there are outer conditions that you can change with your mind, but there are many conditions that you can change with your mind. And that the beginning of the path that leads you out of suffering is to realize that you need to start by changing what you can change, namely your state of mind. So that is the beginning of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Now there are many Buddhists who haven't seen this, and therefore they have turned the Buddha's teachings and the path into an outer path. You just do the right things. Right action, right contemplation, right focus, right this, right that. If you do all the outer things right, they think this is automatically going to improve your life. But that is not understanding the interdependent originations. It's trying to change your physical situation by taking actions. But the interdependent originations say that there is an interdependence between your state of mind and your physical conditions. Your state of mind co-creates your physical conditions. So if you really want to change your physical conditions, you must change your state of mind. If with polluted perception you think or act, suffering follows as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that's pulling the cart. That's an image used by the Buddha. So the cart is behind the ox. Wherever the ox moves, the cart must follow. Your physical conditions are the cart. The ox is your mind. Wherever your mind goes, your physical conditions must follow. So you need to start by changing your mind. That is the essence of the Buddha's teachings. The essence of all true spiritual teachings given throughout the ages, and the essence of valid spiritual teachings given today. And so I know this wasn't quite a crash course. It probably took a little more time. But I hope it's at least given you some thoughts to process about this interdependent originations. There is, of course, more that could be said. Maybe I will be inspired to say more, or if somebody has particular questions, you can ask me a question. I will see how I can answer it. So thank you for listening to this, and I hope it's given you food for thought.